finger. Are we good, Rachel, with the virtual folks? Okay, wonderful. So we have an audience with us here in person, and then we also have folks joining on Teams. So this is a hybrid event. And I'm here to welcome you to our second lecture in the 2023 Center for Children and Families Spring Lecture Series. I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker today, Alva Tang. Dr. Tang joined UT Dallas as an assistant professor of psychology in the fall of 2022. So she's one of our most recent additions. She came to us from a postdoc in the Child Development Lab at the University of Maryland College Park, and she holds a PhD in psychology from McMaster University. Dr. Tang's research lab, the Laboratory for Social Emotional Development, investigates social emotional processes in children and adolescents. She employs a variety of techniques in her research, including EEG, measuring cardiometabolic health, labs observations, and questionnaires. Her highly impactful work has been published in JAMA Psychiatry, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and more than one paper in biological psychiatry. Her work embodies rigor in developmental science, and she's also embraced open science practices, something I have a whole lot of respect for. And she has contributed research from some of the studies that have come out in the last 10 years that have honestly revolutionized the way that we think about early experiences, including the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. As I mentioned, we have folks joining us virtually and in person, so I'm going to ask that everybody please hold their questions until the end when we can take questions from both our in-person audience and those from in Teams. If folks want to start populating the chat with questions, are more than welcome to do that. And we will, unless they specifically flag that it's a quick clarification question, we'll just wait and hold those. So without further ado, can you all join me in welcoming Dr. Alva Tang?
Great, thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. Today, I'll be talking about my work, looking at temperamental differences in development and how they could shape mental health across the life course. So to begin, I'd like to start with an overview of my work that we do in the lab. There's a large literature that shows that many psychiatric and physical illnesses, they don't actually just appear in adulthood. Many of these have developmental roots in childhood and adolescence in terms of children's temperament and social experiences. So what my work tries to do is to make sense of how these individual differences influence development and how they could shape these outcomes later on across life course. So in doing this work, I have been focused on two kinds of individual differences. One is temperament, and there are different kinds of temperaments. The one that I've studied most is called the temperament of shyness, and this is going to be the focus of the talk. The other kind of individual differences I have looked at include early adversity in terms of at first caregiving practices like child maltreatment or being raised in an institution or orphanage. So not every single child with these kinds of exposures would go on to develop mental health disorders. So what my work tries to do is to make sense of the neurobiological and social kinds of processes that could modify risk and resilient trajectories. And in doing this work, I use a variety of methods, and some of these will be presented in the work today. So as I begin the talk on temperament, I want to note how ubiquitous the concept of temperament is. It is all around us. You can just see it in the different kinds of dogs, and the different breeds of dogs surely have different temperaments. But even within the same breed, each dog could be different. And some dogs would be more likely to freeze or run away when they are confronted with novel situations or objects. Other dogs are happy to play with new people or new objects that they encounter. So these characteristics that I've just described are part of a temperament called inhibition or shyness, and you can already see these in different animals, and also you can see an inhibited and shy temperament in humans very early on in development. So what I aim to do over the course of this talk is to show you what this shy phenotype looks like over the life course and how it can shape temperament and health outcomes. So to give you a brief definition of what temperament is, temperament refers to the behavioral and emotional reactivity that you can see very early on in young children. So these are emotional and behavioral styles. Because temperamental differences are earlier appearing, people think of them as biological dispositions. We also know from twin studies and longitudinal studies that temperament is somewhat heritable and somewhat stable across development. But what is more important about temperament is that it influences the way that you think, how you feel, and how you interact with people in the world. And it's really these patterns of the child's thinking, feeling, and their social behaviors and experiences that could carry implications on their health trajectories. So in terms of understanding shyness, there are several approaches. The two frameworks that I use the most in understanding children's development over time are what is called a life course perspective. There's also a dispositional model, and I will tell you a little bit more about both of these. So in a life course approach, uh, it treats life as continuous, so your experiences are cumulative, and each stage of development would build on the next and would have consequences on your later stages of development. But it's not a simple story about how your early development or early temperament determines your outcomes, because we know that children can start with different kinds of temperaments and end up with different outcomes. Even if children have the same temperaments, they could still end up with very different outcomes, depending on what their experiences are. So these are examples of multifinality and equifinality. When you work in a dispositional model, temperaments are thought of as dispositions that could interact with your external environment, like your social relationships and your social behaviors. It can also interact with your internal environment, like how you perceive the world and how you process information in the world. And it's really these interactions between the person and their environments that could amplify or reduce their risks or vulnerabilities to mental health outcomes. So in my work, one of the major research questions that I am interested in is how these individual differences in temperament could influence development to shape different mental health outcomes across the life course. And I'm interested in understanding the processes, the mechanisms, and also the social contextual factors in these relations. So a large portion of my work has focused on making sense of behaviors, cognition, and experiences. Many of these are in the peer context, so studying children's peer relationships, and I'll talk about a few of these studies in this presentation. So here's an outline of this talk. I'm going to show you what this temperamental shyness phenotype looks like over childhood and why it's important to study it. Then I'm going to tell you about 3 studies. One shows you the lasting effects of an inhibited infant temperament on later mental health outcomes as adults. The second study will tell you about different kinds of trajectories that you could see in children over time and how they could change over time and be related to different kinds of outcomes. And then the third study will focus more on the importance of the peer context. So now I'm going to show you some videos of what this shy phenotype looks like and why and how it can be measured through observations and standardized situations in the lab. So the videos I will show you are of the same boy at age 14 months, and then again at age 4, and then again at age 7. And what I want you to see in these videos is how he interacts with unfamiliar people and unfamiliar peers. So the earliest signs of shyness that you can actually see is called behavioral inhibition in infancy. And to measure behavioral inhibition, what people or researchers have done in the past is look at how these young infants would respond to an unfamiliar stranger adult. And so in the first video, you're going to see a boy interact with a pleasant research assistant who is unfamiliar to him. And you would see how he reacts when she invites him to play. So here, The research assistant is outside the frame. You see the boy with the mom. So in this video, you see that the boy has been stuck to his mom's side the entire time. This interaction is supposed to be 10 minutes, but the entire time he would be stuck to his mom. And the other child who is less inhibited, typically what they would do is that they would be a little bit hesitant to play with the research assistant first, but then they would eventually go on to play with that person. So the next time this boy was seen was at age 4. And he was seen in a quartet with 3 other unfamiliar peers. And the idea of that quartet play situation is to see how this kind of inhibited temperament or this inhibited infant would then react in these kinds of situations. So this is age 4. Remember, this is supposed to be a quartet. And you can see that there are only 3 children because the target child is here being brought in by his mom. So here you could see that the boy has calmed down. He was clearly upset. He doesn't want to be here with these unfamiliar peers. And now he sits at the side and he does something that we code his behavior. So he sits on the side, he watches the other children play, but he doesn't play by himself. Usually at this age, you would see even if the children don't play with the other children, they would engage in what we call parallel play. So they would play on the sideline by themselves, but this is not what he does. So the behavioral code to code this kind of behavior is called onlooking and unoccupied. And it's a kind of behavior that these shy children sometimes display. So now the same boy was brought in again at age 7, and the idea is the same. He was going to be seen with 3 other unfamiliar peers. They are different from the ones from age 4, but see if you can pick out the target child here now. So now the children are bigger and they are more spread out in the room. So remember what the boy was doing last time, those onlooking and unoccupied behaviors. And there he is, right? In the corner doing the same thing. And this is another 10-minute free play session. So he just stands there by himself for the entire 10 minutes and he doesn't play with other children. So these kinds of behaviors you see is a more extreme case, but it's consistent with the literature suggesting that shy children have more peer difficulties and they're more likely to become socially withdrawn than children who are not shy. But what's important about the temperament of shyness and why it's important to study it is that it also predicts significant risk for anxiety disorders. So here is a meta-analysis of only prospective studies, so only longitudinal studies that have followed shy children over time. And what they find is that the risk for social anxiety disorders is almost a 6 times increase compared to a child who is not shy. So we know that poor social emotional functioning in childhood could carry significant implications on the levels of functioning later on, but there's actually very limited work to show what these children actually look like when they are adults all grown up. So when I was looking into the literature, there were only a couple of studies that have followed young shy children over time into adulthood. So it includes a cohort from Germany and a cohort from New Zealand. And what they generally find is that shy children would generally grow up to become more introverted, and they would have more internalizing problems like anxiety and depression. So anxiety, the internalizing problems are directed towards the self. But these longer term longitudinal studies are very rare, and the existing evidence had some weaknesses in how inhibition or shyness was measured, in that most of these studies were using parent report. So there was a need to provide stronger and earlier evidence of this type of temperament and how it could influence your outcomes later on as an adult. So using the more objective measures that I showed you in those videos, by coding them, we can provide more objective measures. So here I will move on to the first study to show you the lasting effects of this kind of inhibited temperament very early on. So in this first study, the goal was really to understand the long-term consequences of an inhibited temperament. And I did this study as a postdoc. I got some funding to follow up on a longitudinal cohort, and that cohort was the children that you actually saw in those videos. So you can see what they actually look like when they grow up as adults. So here, the cohort included 165 participants, and they were from the metropolitan area of Washington, D.C. At 14 months of age, their inhibition was measured in the way that I showed you through those videos. And then they had been seen across time in childhood and adolescence for various measures of the brain and their mental health. At age 26, I gave them an online questionnaire to follow up on their levels of functioning and their psychopathology. So what I found here was that the infants with higher levels of behavioral inhibition at 14 months, they continued to rank higher on a reserved personality at age 26, relative to the ones who were less inhibited at 14 months of age. This graph here also shows that the infants who were more inhibited at 14 months of age, they also ranked lower on social functioning with their friends and families at age 26 relative to the ones who were less inhibited at 14 months of age. Now, one thing to note is that these inhibited infants in this cohort, particularly, that in this cohort, they already had been shown to have more anxiety disorders in adolescents. It was published in another paper. So the new question here is whether they would also have other kinds of disorders. And if you know anything about anxiety disorders, is that it usually emerges by late childhood, and it's highly comorbid with things like depression over time. So if you had an anxiety disorder as a child, you're more likely to have depression in adulthood as well. And that is shown in psychiatric epidemiology. About 50 to 60% of children who have anxiety disorders would eventually meet criteria for a depressive disorder later on. So it's a quite significant kind of relation. So in this cohort, the children had reported their mood and anxiety symptoms also when they were adolescents at age 15. So what I did is to look at whether their depressive symptoms actually changed over the period from adolescence to adulthood. So here you can see that the infants who were more inhibited, they had higher changes or increases in depressive symptoms across ages 15 to 26. So these findings tell you how their course of psychopathology would play out as they get older. Now, these subjects also had brain scans at age 15 to measure how they process rewards in the brain when they were adolescents. And in the scanner, the participants completed a widely used task called the monetary incentive delay task. And in this task, you could either win money or lose money. And typically, what you would see in this monetary incentive delay task in normal adults and normal adolescents is that the brain regions for processing rewards like the striatum, would increase in activation when you're expecting or anticipating a reward. So in this case, when you're anticipating getting some money because you had an action that was done. But what has been seen in case control studies of depressed adults, as well as studies of children with a family history of depression, is that these studies usually show that they would have blunted responses when they are anticipating rewards in the ventral striatum. And people have thought of this blunted kind of response to reflect anhedonia or risk preceding depression. So anhedonia is a lack of motivation to do things that you would normally enjoy, lack of energy, lack of motivation in general. So the goal here was really to test whether this kind of blunted brain activation in the striatum would moderate changes in depressive symptoms over time from adolescence to adulthood. So what we find here is that among the more inhibited children, if they showed blunted activation in the ventral striatum when they were anticipating rewards, these children actually showed higher increases in depressive symptoms over time. But this kind of relation wasn't seen in the inhibited children who were sensitive to rewards. So in the blue line here, if they were inhibited, but also they were sensitive to rewards, then they didn't really show these changes in depressive symptoms. So the point of this study was really just to show you how you can objectively measure inhibition or shyness, which are related kinds of temperaments, and how these kinds of temperaments could have lasting effects on your later life outcomes. So there does seem to be some sort of early temperamental bias towards mental health risks across the life course. But as we discussed, there are some cognitive processes like reward processing that could moderate whether you're actually going to develop some of these psychopathology over time. Okay, so that first study showed you lasting relations. There does seem to be a temperamental bias, but it's not deterministic in that many people would say that, oh, I used to be shy, but now I'm not. So if you become less shy over time, can you actually change your life course outcomes? So in this second study, I'm going to show you different shyness trajectories that you can see across time and identify some peer context experiences that could change your developmental course. So here, this study I did as a grad student, and I used a different longitudinal cohort that extends into the fourth decade of life. So the children were followed between age 8 to age 35. So you can see what these people look like when they are even older. So this cohort had 160 participants from Ontario, Canada, and shyness was measured repeatedly using self-report and parent report from childhood to adulthood across ages 8 to 35. And then at the last time point, the participants completed a structured psychiatric interview. So we could look at whether they were more likely to have a diagnosis of some sort. So here, remember the point that I made about people having different trajectories. Here, there were 3 shyness trajectories that you can see. The majority of the sample is categorized by a low stable non-shy trajectory. So that dark black line at the bottom, it's about 60% of this sample. So these people were never shy across their life. There is a decreasing shyness trajectory in the light gray. And you can see that these people's shyness decreased over time. And then there is an increasing shyness trajectory in the orange line. So these people, if they were in this trajectory, they showed increases in their shyness over time across childhood and adolescence. What's important about these trajectories is that they have predictive value for psychopathology in adulthood. And what I found here was that only the increasing shyness trajectory was at greater risk for things like social anxiety disorder, depression, and also substance use disorders. But the decreasing shy trajectory, this is an important point, is that the decreasing shy trajectory did not show any higher risk for any of these disorders. So the point is that if you do become less shy over time, you would be protected in this way. So given that there are different prevalences, I then looked at whether there would be some experiences in your peer relationship that could protect you. And one of the things that I looked at was peer victimization. So because peer victimization is a very robust risk factor for internalizing problems and social withdrawal, even among typically developing children. That's a repeated finding in the literature. It's also true for these shy children, but we don't really know whether there are long-term consequences that would continue into adulthood. So in this study, I looked at the participants' reports of their earlier bullying experiences that they had. And here you can see that the increasing shy trajectory reported higher levels or more frequent verbal bullying before age 16 compared to the low stable non-shy trajectory. And the decreasing shy trajectory was sort of in the middle. They reported levels that were in between the two other trajectories. So briefly, in summary, the findings for this study shows that not all shy children would continue to be shy into adulthood, and not all of them would grow up to have these kinds of emotional problems. The findings show that there are some negative peer experiences in childhood and adolescence that could reinforce your shyness, whether it increases or decreases over time, and it could shape your risk for psychopathology. And by identifying these developmental trajectories and contexts, then we can better know how we can change the children's development for better. So one limitation from this study that I want to point out is that the negative peer experiences were based on self-report. We just asked the participants, how many times were you bullied? And it's possible that children can also process these kinds of events differently and have different outcomes. So each individual could bring with him or her their own personalities, their own social experiences into these kinds of challenges, and they could also react differently. So in this third study, I'm going to talk more about the importance of peer context. And here, this study I also did as a grad student. And in this study, I brought the social exclusion experience into the lab, and the goal was really to understand how this peer context would play out among children and adolescents with different kinds of temperaments, how they vary in their shyness, and how they process these kinds of challenges in their brain. So the reason why it's important to look at neuroprocesses of social exclusion is because if you have higher neurosensitivity to social rejection or social exclusion, that is known to be related to internalizing problems like anxiety and depression in neuroimaging studies. And using more advanced time frequency EEG techniques, you can also see greater responses to social exclusion in children. So here, this study was done by a colleague of mine, and he found that an EEG signature called theta power would increase when you're processing social exclusion. So I also applied this technique in this study. Now, what was also known at the time was that adolescence is a period with considerable social, cognitive, and affective changes. And the theories back then and still today, they suggest that adolescents would have heightened motivation to be accepted by their peers, and they would be more worried about being excluded by their peers because they are always spending a lot of time with their peer groups. But these age effects were not really clear, and it wasn't clear whether the brain would be more sensitive during certain stages of development, like adolescence compared to childhood or adulthood, because most of the studies were looking at a single age group in adolescence and not really comparing them to other age groups. We also know that a lot of these studies used fMRI techniques with very small sample sizes, and because of the small sample size, you really could not study individual differences. So here, the questions that I posed in this study was one, whether adolescents would be related to a heightened neurosensitivity to social exclusion, and the second is whether if you are more shy, whether that kind of temperament would further amplify this kind of sensitivity in your brain. So what I did was I recruited a group of children between ages 10 to 12, and then a group of adolescents 14 to 17, and they reported the children and the parents reported the child's shyness, and then they completed a social exclusion task called Cyberball while wearing an EEG net. So here is the Cyberball task. Cyberball is a ball tossing game. If you were playing this game, you would be told that you would play a game of catch with two other people online, but that's a cover story, so there are actually no real players. All the ball throws in the game were programmed to include you or exclude you. And this game would usually start with an inclusion block in which the participant or you could either receive the ball, which is the favor condition, or you could be waiting for a turn. So you just watch the ball fly across the screen between the two other people, but you're waiting for your turn to be included. So this would go on for several minutes of ball passes, and then the game would seamlessly move into an exclusion block in which the only thing that would ever happen is that you would not get the ball ever again. So in that way, you're excluded. So what I want to emphasize here is that the stimulus or condition that you would see when you're rejected and when it's not your turn, you're actually seeing the same thing on the screen. It's just the ball flying across the screen between the two other players, and that you just don't get it. And the only difference is that your expectation might have changed from being included to being excluded. Okay, so in answering the first question, whether there are age differences, here you can see that the children showed higher neurosensitivity to rejection events compared to the favor event when they were included, but they don't really distinguish the not my turn events from the rejection events. So this is actually, the children distinguish the rejection events from the favor inclusion events, and they are also distinguishing the not my turn events from the favor events. But in the adolescents, you see a different pattern in that the adolescents show heightened neurosensitivity to rejection compared to when they were included, but they don't really show a difference between the not my turn events and when they get rejected. So this pattern kind of makes sense if you think about the day-to-day social lives of adolescents, in that they spend a lot of time with peers and their friends, and they sort of have to be hypersensitive to even events when it's not their turn, so that they can keep track of whether they are included. And it might be related to their worries about being excluded or ostracized by their peers. To answer the second question here, I looked at whether there are additive effects of shyness and age. So remember how the group of adolescents were processing the exclusion events and the not my turn events. They weren't processing them differently in the brain. They were showing the same kind of neurosensitivity to both kinds of events. So here I used a different score by calculating that theta EEG power and taking a subtraction. If you see a score of 0 on the y-axis, that means there was no difference between the two conditions. But if you see greater increases, then they were reacting to the rejection condition more compared to the other condition. So here, the results actually show that shyness in adolescents, the blue line, has no effect on the adolescents. But in the children, if they were more shy, they actually showed that they had the similar kind of responses as adolescents. So the children who were more shy at younger ages were already processing these two kinds of events more like an adolescent. And the similarity could be related to their similar social fears, or they could be socially motivated by acceptance. Okay, so in summary, the findings suggest that the emergence of neurosensitivity to exclusion is present by adolescents, but you can also observe this in younger children who are more shy. Obviously, a limitation of this study is that it's cross-sectional, so future longitudinal studies are needed to formally assess whether these neuroprocesses would be linked to later outcomes in terms of their mental health and social functioning. So in conclusion, I presented 3 studies So I would like to end with some general conclusions. And there are really two things that I could conclude here. So first is that the findings suggest that temperament has lasting influence on social emotional development, but there are also developmental processes that could play important roles in contributing to the continuity and change in a person. And that continuity and change could also be related to your risk and opportunities for psychopathology. So the processes that I identified include some social cognitive functions, peer relationships, and also processing of salient information within peer contexts. And overall, this work is really to provide insight into the developmental processes and risk factors that are linked to psychopathology so that we can better understand and we can enhance our ability to implement prevention strategies to promote healthy development for children. So with that, I'll end this talk. Thank you for coming. These are my funding sources from the past and my mentors and collaborators.
So folks that are joining us online, you can feel free to put your, is this
This one is.
this one? Okay. Yep, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And we'll also take questions from the room. I will take the opportunity to ask the first question. And my question for you is, like, the first video that you showed of the little toddler who then, you showed developmentally, I kept thinking about attachment. So what do you think about the links between shyness and attachment? And if like attachment could potentially, like a secure attachment could be protective of some of these outcomes related to internalizing symptoms later in life?
So there have been studies that looked at both temperament and attachment, and they do show that if you have a secure attachment, you're more likely to be protected if you are shy. But then there are also studies that looked at whether this kind of temperament is actually a reflection of the attachment style itself, and it's not. So there have been studies to suggest that they are separate concepts.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And I think Jackie?
This isn't a well-formulated question, it's just some thoughts, and then I want to get your thoughts.
Okay.
I'm wondering about a little bit about measurement, but also a little bit about parenting. So you mentioned that one advantage is to not use. I wonder, probably not the case with Joey, but for a child that maybe is not as extremely shy, you bring them in the lab, perhaps they're just having a really bad day. So it can be nice, I would think, to have parents report where they can see across multiple contexts. But then your later studies, you've got parent and child report that made me think more about the parent's perception of their child. Oh, this child is too shy, they're too introverted, I'm not like that. Why is this child like that? So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about measurement, maybe one, but then also how parents' perceptions of children influence their behaviors around shyness or.
Right. So usually the gold standard would be using multiple kinds of assessments. So objective and also subjective through self-report and parent report. And you can also get teacher or peers if you get like sociometric. You use sociometric techniques in schools. So that would be the best thing to do, a combination, right? In that study, it was just trying to separate variance. So if you take an objective measure and you have self-report later on, then you don't have overlap in what you're trying to find, and you can provide stronger argument for your argument of temperament. So that's why I did that. But usually you should be using multiple kinds of assessments. So that would be the best. And then in terms of the mom or father being biased in their perceptions. So there are studies to suggest that it's a trait that this is a trait that runs in families, right? So if the mom or dad is also more shy or anxious, then they could have reporting bias. And so we should be aware of that and also use multiple kinds of assessments. Yeah.
Hi, this is a talk. So my question is about changes in trajectory. both in terms of shyness, which is what we're focusing on, but also in terms of reactivity. So I know that's something that can be measured in babies. A relative who has a very reactive daughter at age 14 months. And so she's wondering what she can do as a parent to help her child be less reactive. So in studying those trajectories over time, the kids that showed a decreasing trajectory for shyness had better outcomes. I'm hoping that's the case for behavioral reactivity as well, but also what do we know about things that parents can do that influence those trajectories?
Absolutely. So there have been many studies that looked at parenting practices. So in the literature, we know that if the child is really shy, and if the parent is overprotective or over-intrusive in trying to protect them and not letting them be independent in peer situations or other kinds of situations where they confront novel situations, then that could lead to them being incompetent socially and also lead to them having higher risk for these disorders. So the best thing would be being like an authoritative parent, but also being warm and encouraging at the same time. So the parent can spend more time to encourage the child to go on to interact with other children. And then in terms of reactivity, like what kind of reactivity are you talking about? Like an irritable child or?
So strong emotional responses. So things that some babies are just neutral on feeling very, very happy or very, very angry or very, very sad. Everything is strong.
Yeah. So there is another kind of temperament that people call irritability and has received more attention in recent years. And that has been related to things like ADHD and stuff. So that kind of temperament, if paired with harsh parenting, so if the parent scolds the child a lot, then it's actually going to make his or her development worse for their outcomes like externalizing behaviors and ADHD. So in that way, you sort of have to tailor the parenting to different temperamental styles for sure.
Let's maybe take one more question from the room, and then I'm seeing questions come in from the chat, so we'll pivot to there. And Margaret, you can dive after questions.
Thank you. This stimulates so many thoughts and questions, and God, I've got two different areas, but I too was very interested in the trajectory slopes that you showed, and noticed that the one that seemed most concerning, obviously, for later psychopathologies were those that increased in shyness. And in terms of your lines, and I know that pulls together a lot of individual differences, that line indicated that they started low in shyness and then increased. And you've studied experiences of bullying, their response, their reports of that, and that might be a contributing factor. Maybe that is a factor that's not related to their shyness initially. I don't know. But I think you're probably thinking about a lot of other factors and buffering factors. So what about friendships? You've experienced bullying, but you have a close friend. That would be an interesting combination. What do you think about that?
So there actually has been studies by Ken Rubin who looked at friendships and socially withdrawn children, and he finds that if you have at least one best friend that's stable, then you're less likely to develop these kinds of loneliness and depressive symptoms over time. So having one best friend actually helps. But he also shows that the shy children are more likely to become friends with other people or other children who are also socially withdrawn. So similar friends attract each other. So you don't want to get into a situation where they're both co-ruminating. Yeah.
And we'll save my other questions.
We'll come back. We'll come back to the room for a second. So Lynn, I'm hoping that you can hear us. And if you'd like to unmute to ask your question, you can go ahead and do that. And I'll give you a second to. Otherwise, I can ask a question on your behalf.
Thank you for this talk. I was wondering if there's any evidence of what type of intervention for children or teens who have this shy temperament could support or protect them from future mental health problems.
So there are a couple that have been tested and evaluated. One is something called the Cool Kids program from Ronald Rappe. And he has tested this and found that originally he was doing this for children with social anxiety disorders, but later has also been done on children who are more inhibited, and it works. So it's like a 12-week program, and that you would train the kid to act differently in terms of how they interact with other kids. There's another program called the Turtle Program from the University of Maryland, run by Andrea Cronus Toscano. And what she tries to do is to change the child's behavior and also the parent's behavior so that you can also change the child afterwards. So both programs have worked and they are validated, and they have been pretty good at changing the children's shy behaviors.
Yeah. And I think Maxine, you are up next. Would you like to unmute?
Hi, this is Maxine. My question is about extreme social anxiety, children who have evidenced selective mutism as children. And do you have any information about how their social anxiety progressed through the years? I'm a speech therapist. I've worked with children in the past who had selective mutism and then since learned that it is more of a social anxiety issue. But I often wonder how those children are doing now as they become adults. So just curious if you had encountered any participants in that way.
In my experience, I haven't looked at selective mutism. It is now part of social anxiety disorder in the DSM. But that's an interesting question that should be followed in the future, perhaps. Yeah.
And Natalie, thank you, beat me to it. So, okay, so Natalie's question here is anything new in research-based worth noting regarding the impact of COVID on these social interactions, temperament on child and youth?
Yes, so there has been some newer studies looking at inhibited children and through COVID. So back at the University of Maryland, we had this study of another cohort that followed them over time. And these children, through COVID, they actually expressed more worries during COVID. And if they did express more worries during COVID, then they were more likely to have increases in anxiety symptoms over time throughout COVID and after COVID.
Yep, and then you can come back to there. Thank you.
Mhm.
And sibling influence. How does that play?
So there have been some studies not particularly looking at shyness particularly, but personality differences in terms of birth order. And there have been some studies to suggest if you're the firstborn, then you're more conscientious and competent and extroverted, but then it's not clear findings. So there are mixed findings, but that's the extent that I know about this literature. Yeah.
You're, predicting outcomes, but I keep thinking about what's predicting the trajectory, right? And so, we talked about victimization and friendship, but what are some of the other things? I keep thinking about other temperamental dispositions that might interact or caregiving quality and I can imagine a whole host of things, but what is the latest? What does the research say on sort of predicting why some kids end up being increasing in shyness and why some decrease?
Yes, so there have been some studies that look at like genetic kinds of influences and then parenting influences, and then one of the most stable or most well-known finding that has been found is that if the mom is depressed or anxious, then the child is likely to also be that way. So there are, yeah.
Those increasers over their life course then?
So there have been less studies that have looked at over the life course. So, but we do know that parenting does matter, but maybe not in studies that have looked at it continuously into adulthood. Within childhood to adolescence, there are studies to show that the parenting actually matters a lot. Yeah, and also child care experiences would help if you put them in a high quality childcare early on and they learn to interact with other children early on, then they're less likely to become shy.
I get that. Another question. I also noticed on your graph of trajectories that those outcomes over time were adjusted for the child's sex and for the parent's SES.
Right.
Now, did you just adjust because everybody adjusts, or were those two factors related to those trajectories?
So they weren't related, but then it would be interesting to look at whether those trajectories interact with socioeconomic status, right? And I think well, in the literature, very few people have done that because they are smaller cohorts and you don't get a nice variation of different kinds of SES status. In a newer study that I used a population cohort from the UK where we had 10,000 children in that cohort, I was able to look at interactions with SES, and I did find that the ones from low SES were more likely to be categorized in a socially withdrawn and shy kind of temperament. So at this point, very little is known about how your family background plays a role.
The child's gender. Are girls more represented in increasing shyness?
No, so the gender differences were not there. So in terms of like how they change, but then there are some researchers who find that for boys, if they are shy, they have worse outcomes. Yeah.
All right, so can everyone help me in thanking Dr. Tang for that wonderful presentation and all of one announcement. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, okay. Yep. Thank you. So we have one more talk in our series, and it's happening next week. And let's see if I can get this name right. Dr. Diana Mitchie. Mitchke, thank you. So you should have done this part. So she's joining us from UT, University of Texas at Arlington. She will be here in person with us, which is wonderful. And I believe we're back maybe in just the other room. So we're going to be right here in this room. So please join us. We do have breakfast for those who can come in person and enjoy a bite to eat. You can register to attend via a link that's going to go in the chat. And there's also a link in the chat from earlier for feedback and anything else.
Dr. Mitchie will be.
Yes. Yep. So the title of that talk is Navigating a New Normal, How Newly Resettled Refugee Children and Adolescents Adjust to Life in the United States. I think this is going to be a wonderful and insightful talk on something that we haven't heard a whole lot about in our CCF series recently. So please join us next week for that. And once again, thank you, Dr. Tang, for such a wonderful talk.